Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Hey, Ariel, welcome to another season.
Yeah, Peter, here we are, season 2. School is starting, to get going again, and it's so good to be back here with you.
Well, I'm glad you picked the theme of surviving to thriving. I think it was important. And, this is what a great kickoff that John Hattie was able to do the podcast, our first podcast for the season. Always amazing to talk to. John has been, such a good mentor to me over the past 8 years that I feel like, I'm very fortunate to have him, but also just talking to him is like a master class. It's just like, you have to be on. And he just brought so much wisdom to our conversation today.
Yeah, and this masterclass, I think, is perfect for kicking off our season of moving from surviving to thriving, because today it's all about DeImplementation. I think, when we were in COVID, things were necessarily simplified a little bit. Like, you do this one thing and that's all you need to do, and it's overwhelming, but that's it. Everything else, all the distractions were kind of removed. And as we head back to schools, I think the temptation is, we have to start up all of these things again and, ramp up and accelerate even faster and do even more. And so I love that we're starting the season with a reminder to simplify again and focus on what works best. So I'm very excited for people to hear this message.
Well, and let them get at it then, and they can hear from John Hattie.
All right, the man himself. Here we go.
John Hattie, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. It's good to have you on.
It's great to be here, Peter. It's always good to talk with you, sir.
Yeah, how are things in Melbourne?
Well, Melbourne is up and down. We've had 150 days last year of lockdown, and then 85 days of donuts, 0 deaths, 0 cases. Then we had 1, so we went back into lockdown 3 weeks ago. And when we talk lockdown, it's stage 4 lockdown, no more than 3 kilometres from your house, blah, blah, blah. Then we've, touch wood, tomorrow we'll come out of it, but New South Wales is going into it. So it's that up and down notion. Australia is unbelievably slow on vaccinations. It's a tiny, less than 5% because of supply. We just can't get supply. So I think it's another year at least before our borders open and I can smell an airport again, Peter.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's at least good to be able to talk to you this way. Last year, you and I, we did a Corwin coffee chat, and it was very early on. I think it was like maybe April or even May. But I had asked you about, do you think this experience of COVID is going to change the way people operate? And what was interesting back then is we really didn't know how long it was going to go on, right? Do you think, given the experiences that you're seeing happening in Australia and also just around the world with pivoting, that's the big word, and hybrid learning, and I'm even seeing schools that are creating like this remote school within their public school system. Do you think that COVID has been a catalyst for change, or do you think when things go back to normal, people are going to sort of revert back to old habits?
Well, sadly, if you look at other calamities like this, and there have been many. In fact, one author recently made a good comment that if you think last year was unprecedented, you have no understanding of history. This has happened. The 1953 Asian flu that went through the world killed more people, more disruptions. We've forgotten that. There are many other incidences. So sadly, I think that in a couple of years' time, as this starts to retreat, one hopes, we will rush back to the old normal very fast. And that's been the history of many of these kind of things. So I'm at the moment, as you know, Peter, I have a political role here in Australia, so I get to meet ministers on a very regular basis. And they're all saying to me, no, we've got to get back to normality. It's better for the students because they understand it. The teachers like it because they understand their old hierarchies. And so I'm desperately trying to say, but there is a lot of good learning to do here. But unfortunately, also the whalers and the gnashers of teeth are out, and they're arguing about the horrific learning loss, which I think is an insult to teachers who have done a stunning job to make sure that there wasn't a dramatic learning loss overall. And then all the well-being people out there, like the evidence is coming out now, and I'm certainly looking at this, that in general, well-being went up last year. For many kids, school can be a tough place to go to. But for those, and it's a small percentage, but for those for it went down dramatically. And so there is a bit of a mixed message there, but we've known for years, Peter, that failure generates more funds. So we love to promote the notion that we've had a massive failure. So no, sadly, I think that we are going to miss. I would hope that we still have a lot to learn from last year. And I know some systems, Ontario is allowing schools to go completely hybrid. I'm not sure that's the right answer. I think that a lot of the things we learned from COVID, we can do in the regular school. But I know I have a hunch that's what we're going to go back to.
Yeah, you raised a good point. In talking with people, and one of the things that I sometimes get concerned with is the COVID learning loss conversation. I feel like it almost, and tell me if I'm wrong here, it almost seems like it's setting up sort of a generation of people that are going to be enabled, because everything just turns to they can't do it because they had COVID learning loss. It feels like it's coming to that. And I worry that we're going to create a generation of victims. And so how should we look at that? How should we look at, we're going back to school in the fall, schools in North America at least, or at least in the United States, I should say, are going back in the fall. If we could get away from the COVID learning loss conversation, what could we turn that conversation into, which would be more positive, if that question makes sense?
Well, the line we're taking is the concept of rebound, and that we treat coming back in the new year as a chance to accelerate. Now, we should do that every year.
Yeah.
But this year in particular, I think that we've got a chance to say, let's treat the new year as accelerate. And what I would hope would happen in the first month of the new year is we don't presume. We don't presume that last year was a disaster for all the kids. We actually check out what happened. Now, for some kids, it was a disaster. Access alone is a problem. For some kids, it was a success. They learned how to be more self-regulated. They learned how to take on more responsibility in their learning. The one word that's new in this business now is not only were many students more effective in home learning, they were more efficient. And they did the work in shorter time. We've got to, let's see what happened with each kid so that we don't presume about what's happening out there. And then say, well, what did we learn last year? Like I would argue, for instance, that one of the big things we learned was that kids are more likely over social media, such as Zoom or chat, to talk about what they don't know than they do in the regular classroom. So how do we optimize that? And I'd hope that every teacher and every school is asked to write up 5 bullet points or 5 things they're doing in COVID teaching that they want to reintroduce into the regular school. So treat it as a positive conversation. And I invite every educator in your country to, every time they've heard the word learning loss, look those people in the eye and said, I worked my heart out last year to do the best by my students. And so you're saying automatically it's a learning loss. Some of my students prospered, some of them did not. But overall, and there is, Klaus Zara has just published a paper with about 20 odd million kids in it. The effect size about minus 0.1. We can rebound from that reasonably quickly if we put our hearts to it. And so I don't think last year necessarily was, in general. Now, don't get me wrong. Some kids, absolutely. It was a learning loss. Some of our brightest students who are very, very dependent on the teachers had learning loss. Some of our students that had learning loss in the regular school before COVID, it probably magnified it last year. But that's my point. Don't presume, check out each person. And so maybe I'm reducing my expectations now because I'd hoped that we would have introduced a new syntax of learning from last year. I don't think it's going to happen.
I remember a conversation we had a long time ago too about, because the COVID learning loss conversation sort of reminded me of the summer learning loss and, all of those. And I remember you saying, it's not just the summer that we have to worry about. It's the fact that for the month before the schools closed down for the summer, we started to sort of let go of the reins and much more relaxed in learning. And then the month that we come back to school, we're reviewing everything that the kids already knew. So we're wasting that time. And I think maybe that's a part of what I'm thinking about too with the COVID learning loss conversation is I've been reading a ton about like what to do in the fall when they're coming in. There's this deficit mindset that the kids are going to be at a disadvantage without even considering the fact that some of them may actually not be at a disadvantage. And then I just saw in Ed Week a study done with the fact that there are parents that are going to be quote unquote redshirting their kindergartners. They're going to hold the kindergartner back for another year before they move them on. And some of that worries me because I feel like it's a knee-jerk reaction without putting a lot of thought into it first or having a lot of facts before they do it.
But we've known for a long time that of all the negative influences on kids, the one that stands out is retention, holding kids back a year, the redshirting notion. So those parents who are going to do it will severely disadvantage their kids. And I notice in some of your legislation at the moment for funding, retention's mentioned. Now, not only is it a disaster in terms of their achievement, sadly, 80% of the kids who are held back are African American or Hispanic. And so that equity issue should disgust us. And so I just hope that that doesn't happen. But then sometimes parents, sometimes teachers, they hold kids back with the noblest of intentions. And it typically works with the philosophy of, I got to know the child, if only I had him for more time, I could fix him. Well, you had him for a year and you failed. And I think there are much better ways to worry about how we can work with those kids than holding them back a year.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid who was retained in fourth grade, had the same teacher twice. I mean, I barely graduated from high school. So every year was just a struggle that can really kill the self-esteem and,
And the expectations.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go from the whole deficit mindset to a different mindset. Now, last year you had a book come out on, that you had focused on the 10 mind frames, right? And where do the mind frames intersect with what we're going through now? Whether you're talking about them for students, teachers, or leaders, because I know you've covered all that ground, but where do the mind frames intersect with our current reality?
Well, it's more than that, Peter. My son and I have just finished the first draft, or sent to the publishers, 10 mind frames for parents. And we're also looking at 10 mind frames for students. Now, where all this came from is, over the years I've been doing in this work, one of the takeaways is that teachers say things like, oh, we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. And one of my frustrations is it's not the doing of this or that that matters. It's how they think about their doing, how they make those moment-by-moment decisions. And I would argue that we've dramatically underestimated and underemphasized the incredible expertise that teachers have about how they think. And if you look at David Berliner's work and expertise and the work that many others have done, it comes back to those thinking. So hence that emphasis on mind frames that really underlies what truly makes the difference. And as you know, in our work, Peter, when we work in schools, one of the hardest things to do is to get teachers to take attribution, that it was them that caused the learning. They're so nice. They're very generous. They give the credit to the kids. And it's kind of like looking at COVID. They say, oh, last year was a disaster because we didn't have them in front of us. They weren't coming to regular school, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think, again, we underestimate that expertise of teachers to minimize that effect. And so focusing on that. Now, our good friend Carol Dweck has her mindset. And as I said to her one time, one of her difficulties is she only has one, the growth versus the fixed. And so I decided not to fall in that trap. And if people don't like it, or as you know, many people misinterpret what she says, and then they say, oh, it doesn't work. So I've got 10, even though there's only one repeated 10 times in many senses, to try and get at this notion that what does it mean to evaluate your impact? What does it mean to critique whether you're having sufficient impact on your kid? What do you mean by impact? How do you seek that evidence? So it's that kind of thinking. So that's where the mind frames come, is to try and orient the conversation back from, well, if I do X, Y, and Z, things will happen, as opposed to, if this is how I think. And certainly our more recent work is trying to really hone in on this notion of evaluative thinking, which underlies those mind frames.
Yeah, you just reminded me of something. You've given me some post-traumatic stress here, because I remember years ago I talked to you. I talked to you and said I was big on reflection. And I remember you looked at me very point blank and said, Peter, and I actually just used this phrase and gave you credit because I said John Hattie ruined reflection for me. But you said, Peter, if you're reflecting without evidence, you're just remembering it the way you think it happened and not necessarily the way it did happen. I remember just thinking, no, that just ruined reflection. Tell me if I'm wrong here. Because when I do work with teachers and they will talk to me about, well, what evidence do you want me to collect, or what evidence do you think I should collect? And I've often said the best evidence they can collect is the evidence that they come up with together. I mean, isn't that sort of the part of the groundwork of building collective teacher efficacy? Is that when we're looking at learning, then we start to say, so what evidence could we collect to understand how well we did this or how much we learned? And also, being able to do that with students, like even bringing students into the conversation to say, if we're going to learn this, what kind of evidence could we collect? Are those the proper conversations to be able to have?
Yeah, Peter, like Graham Nuttall showed 80% of what happens in your class you don't see or hear. So why would I privilege the 20% that you're going to reflect on? And so but the other side of it is what you're saying when you say reflection has the essence of the right notion. And the way I see it is the Alice in Wonderland notion, where she went through the looking glass and saw how other people saw her. And that's the kind of reflection that I want to see. And it's kind of what you're saying with the evidence. I want to hear how teachers interpret the evidence. I worry that we're just going to switch our conversation from the old conversation, let's bring along the test scores, to let's bring along the evidence. It's not the evidence that matters. It's the interpretations you're making. And I want to hear, Peter, how you're making your interpretations. And I want you to hear how I would make those interpretations so that we can reflect on perhaps the biases we both have, the different ways of seeing things. And one of the things I really like from the medical profession is the concept of a second opinion. You would never, if you had a major illness, you would never pause to think, oh, I need a second opinion. In education and teaching, when we ask for a second opinion, it's almost like we're insulting you that we're going to seek another notion. Well, kids deserve second opinions. And you're right. I want to hear how the kids interpret. And if they're interpreting that they're not learning or they are learning, that's part of the interpretations I make as to what I'm going to do. So yes, the essence of collective efficacy is this notion of having multiple views on the interpretations of the evidence. Yesterday, we got our new book on student collective efficacy. And it's the same concept. How do you get students to see the world through the shoes and the eyes of other students, and so that they have different perspectives on their world? Neither of them is necessarily right or wrong. They're different perspectives, interpretations. But that's the healthy part. And that's what I'd like to see happen in staff rooms a lot more than I typically do, of teachers actually sharing their interpretations about the evidence. And sometimes you're going to say, well, that's not sufficient evidence. I want to see the test scores, or I want to see artifacts of students' work, or I want to hear the students talking. Great. Now we're cooking.
Yeah, and see, with you saying that, I always feel like we were talking about Carol Dweck, how people have misunderstood her research. I often feel like your research has been misunderstood because people will look at it sometimes as it's all about the effect size, when in actuality, to me, I think it's about what are we looking at and bringing more depth to it, bringing more depth to the conversation, just what you were just saying. It's not just about the evidence, it's the conversation we're having. And to me, that's about uplifting our profession as something like we just go in and we teach something in a book, as opposed to what I think what's been at the core of your work is, no, I want us to be able to talk about what we're seeing and how we're evaluating and where we can go deeper, not just putting more on. Yes, we have a lot of influences on learning. Yes, we've researched a lot of those, but it's really about what influences are going to be the best for you in this situation and what's going to bring more depth. Would you say do people often misunderstand that and they just kind of go for the effect size instead of what you really want is the deep conversation?
Yeah, and I take a lot of blame for that, Peter, and the way I've written in the early years, and I'm trying all the time, as you know, to get across that message. But I don't resile from the data on which it's based, which of course is the effect size. But it's the whole point. It's like tests. Get above the data, get to the interpretation. And that's exactly the interpretation you just said there. That's what I'm trying to aim for.
Yeah, I think you have opened me up, and I've always thanked you for this. You have opened me up to research that I never would have considered before. And sadly, I don't know if I would have considered that as a principal too. I think I had my go-tos, but you were talking about Graham Nuttall, Hidden Lives of Learners. There have been so many pieces of research that you've introduced me to that has completely opened up my world that I want to figure out. Like I always want to figure out how do we get educators and leaders talking about this and bringing students into the conversation and those kind of things. One of the pieces of research that you've recently introduced me to, and I have to be honest with you, I have not been able to let it go since you've talked to me about it. And I know you know that because I've emailed you about it, but the whole idea of DeImplementation, and you sent me 4 pieces of research, all from the medical field. And it was so interesting to me because one of the researchers said it's about getting rid of low value practices. And I kept thinking about, with COVID and what we can learn, and maybe we don't need to be doing so much, we don't need to be doing, as a former first grade teacher, every lesson was like 10 minutes and you're just doing all this stuff. De-implementation is about getting rid of low value practices. And when I intersect that with the fact that we've seen workloads increase on the part of teachers and students, when you're looking at de-implementation and you're facing things like, there are partial reduction, as you know, or a complete reversal on what you're doing. What I think is interesting, what has been your interest with de-implementation? Where did that come from before I ask you any further questions?
Well, it was, as we go about working with schools on visible learning, that temptation is to add more on top. And one of the things that we certainly know is that you've got to tackle how teachers think, whereas more often they want to talk about what they do. They want tips or tricks to add to their current repertoire. And if they're in that zone where they're having a high impact, that's wonderful, that's great. But if they're not, it's a fundamental change in how they think you want to do. And so one of the things we looked at and started working was to say, well, what can we stop doing? What can we actually de-implement? And certainly when you talk to school leaders, they say, we've got so much going on in the school. We did a review of one high school not a few years ago about their after-school programs. They had 82 after-school programs. And interestingly, we did the evaluation in that school to show that only 3 of them had any positive impact on kids' learning. And about a year later, I went back to the school and I said, well, tell me what's happened with the after-school programs. And I said, have you still got those 3 programs? He said, oh, we listened to your review. We got rid of the other 78, 79 programs and replaced them with 78 other programs. And so they didn't de-implement at all. And that sort of opened up this notion. And we've just done a major piece of work here in Australia on teacher workload, teacher red tape. And it was really interesting to say and come up with proposals that would get rid of it. No, they just replaced it. Same with principals. They talk about red tape all the time, but they kind of like going back to their office and dealing with some of that red tape. And so it's really, really hard to stop things. And this is the point about COVID. The schools, we have hierarchies in schools. We have certain subjects are privileged. Teachers prefer to and see hierarchy as if you're teaching the brighter students as opposed to the kids at the other distribution, and so on down the list. And it's kind of not talked about. It's there, but it's not talked about. And when someone comes along and they're going to de-implement something, it's a threat. It's a threat to the hierarchies. And my worry about COVID is that we're going to say, no, we need everything we did before plus more. And I challenge you to ask in your school, what are you prepared to give up? It's, as you know, Peter, it's an incredibly tough conversation. Part of it is when you give up, you want to give up what someone else is doing, but what do you want to give up? It's a really tough conversation, but we can't keep just adding more and more. Like we're going to now add social and emotional learning and expect teachers to become professional counsellors. I seriously worry about that. So this whole notion of de-implementation, I'll be honest, I'm struggling to know how to do it, but I think it's a really interesting concept. And as you say, it came out of of the medicine area. It's used in the engineering literature to say, what are we then going to start not doing to start doing these things? What's your experience, Peter?
So ever since we talked about it and I started reading the articles, and I've actually written about it for the Ed Week blog. And then last week I tweeted out just a series, I think there were like 3 tweets in a row. And it was explaining kind of the Cliff Notes version of de-implementation. And then the third tweet was, what would you de-implement? And it's been really interesting because a lot of people love the idea, but they can't name it. Now, I ran a workshop for, I trained all the instructional coaches for literacy, K2 instructional coaches for New York City. So I was doing a webinar and I brought in de-implementation and I talked about how you and I had been talking about it in the articles. So I asked them, what would you de-implement? And it was really interesting there because they started to get a little bit deeper. Like some of the ULIT coaches were saying things like, the research is not showing that running records are valuable from a K2 experience. They might be valuable 3-5, but from a literacy or science of reading standpoint, they're not valuable from K2. So we had this really robust and pretty fantastic conversation. They even shared articles. But even within that hour that I was working with them on that, and that came up, I still had a number of people come in and say, but I like running records. They didn't say what they learned from them. They said, but I like running records. And I agree with you. I feel like there's something there that I can't let go of. And I would like to, and I think it helps with the research that you sent me, because when they're talking about partial reduction, to me, what you were just talking about is one of the key things. I remember working with a school district in Massachusetts, and there was a middle school leader, and we were talking about school climate, and he was there with his instructional leadership team. And he said, we need to get a school climate committee. And I said, no, you have your instructional leadership team. He goes, no, we need a new committee. We need a school climate committee. And one of his teachers came up very frustrated, and she said, he doesn't even show up to the instructional leadership team. And now he wants a new committee. And I think, why do we do this to ourselves? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it need to be busy? Is it need to be wanted? Or I'd rather, we've been talking about working smarter and not harder, and yet we don't seem to do it.
I think it's insurance. It's kind of like where I buy insurance. The one that was always struck me, as you know, my background is in measurement. And you go into schools and you ask to look at what tests they're using, what data they've got. And then you ask and usually they're quite resplendent. They say, oh, we do this test every year, we do this, we do running records, we do whatever. And you say, well, how do you go about interpreting them? And then there's a bit more of a silence. And like I remember going to these series of schools over the years, and they use this particular test that's quite well known. And I said, what do you do with it? So we record it. I said, what would happen if you didn't do it? Oh, no, we can't do that. We've always done it. But you don't use it. But we've always done it. And it's that insurance notion, just in case we've got this, and we've got a committee, we've got this. It's that safety notion. You can't accuse me of not concerned about school climate in that school, Peter, because I have a committee. And so there's a lot of that kind of insurance notion going on. And and also our accountability press has often meant that, can you point to evidence that you are dealing with X, Y, and Z in your school? Yes, I've got a committee, I've got a policy. Like here at my own university, we have a whole policy framework that is, you cannot believe. We have there are more professional staff than there are academics in my university. And they prepare all these incredible documents and policy. And I'm saying and a while ago, I actually got onto the vault and went in. And one of these people I met a few days later, she said, oh, we're so pleased with you. You're the first person to ever go in and look at a policy. I now, unfortunately, have justified their jobs for the next 10 years by doing it. But that's how we think. Yeah. So there is a lot of insurance notion thing. But I want to come back to your point. And I invite our listeners here. It would be really good if we started a very healthy conversation about de-implementation and how to do it and the different kinds. And also, we go back to your previous point, 10 years ago, Peter, schools weren't that interested in research. It wasn't part of their psyche. That has been the biggest change in the last 10 years. Teachers and particularly school leaders now will look to research. Now, doesn't mean to say they agree with it, but that's not what I'm saying. But they will look to it. And I think that's an incredibly healthy move because teachers are very good critics. And so adding another part to their their critique is healthy. And I think this is a topic that you and I, we're early days of exploring this, and it's a real interesting problem.
Yeah. And as far as the research, I mean, I just know that a lot of it, from my master's to the second one I did in leadership to the doctorate, it was sort of that self-exploration. And then, of course, being with you has always been like a master class. So, John, I could talk to you forever. I will say that this season that you are kicking off for us, thank you very much, is on surviving to thriving. I think you gave us a lot to be able to talk about. And, from the deep conversations that we need to have to the deficit mindset that we need to get rid of, to understanding where our students are, involving them in the conversation, but also this whole idea of DeImplementation. I'm going to be talking to you so much more about DeImplementation as I move on. But I just want to thank you so much for always being so giving for your time. And thank you for being on the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Pleasure to be doing this with you, Peter. Thank you.
So, Ariel, I wasn't lying when I said I feel like it's a master class. John just always, to me, I've been fortunate because he's just been always so giving with his time, but he has introduced me to not only his research, but he's introduced me to so many great pieces of research that has completely reshaped how I think, and we certainly got into it. And the biggest and best that he's given me in a while is DeImplementation. He sent me these 4 articles, months ago, and there's just something about that topic that I think is so interesting, especially when we know that, at least in the United States, 42% of principals say they want to leave their job. We know that 75% of teachers have talked about feeling stress and anxiety. And when we look at things like workload, we know that's increased on the part of teachers and leaders over the past 15 years. And many times we talk about it being due to accountability. But what we also know from just hearing from John is that sometimes we're doing this to ourselves and we don't need to. What was your takeaway from the conversation?
Yeah, exactly. I think, that question of what are you willing to give up, that really stuck out to me. And after the recording ended, John was saying, a really effective principal or really effective school leader is going to come in and just kind of naturally know, oh, we're going to stop doing these things. We're going to start doing these other things. And an effective leader is going to be able to kind of whittle down what's not worth spending our time on and what are the things that are worth spending our time on. And that's what I think we need right now in this post-pandemic, world. I also loved his emphasis on, evidence, looking at the evidence and really looking at each kid individually instead of making these broad assumptions, really looking at each kid's individual learning, because for some kids, COVID was great and distance learning was great and they've been doing wonderful. And for other kids, obviously the story was very different. And so you just can't make assumptions on a broad scale. You have to look at every kid's learning individually.
Yeah, and I enjoyed the part about, and it occurred to me when I was talking to him that so often John's research, or what people think about John, is the effect size piece. And he said, in some ways he did that to himself, and we get it. Years ago it was the numbers, but what it brought up is the ability to have deeper conversations about what we're doing in their classrooms. And I think that is at the heart of the research and his work. And I know that just from knowing him, but also working with him. I think, and I appreciated the fact that he got into that when we were having the discussion, because I feel like it elevates, I feel like we need to always find ways to elevate what leadership and what teaching looks like in schools, because the rhetoric around public education can be negative. Mm-hmm. So what can we do to counteract that? And it's having these deep conversations to talk about what learning looks like. And I think that's what John's research and what the core part of his work is all about. So I'm really glad we got into that, but such an amazing way to start off.
That's right. I really hope that listeners share this with your leadership teams and with your teachers, and let this be the start of a conversation. I mean, there was so much here that, we could dig into. Like you said, we could talk to John all day, and we hope that you go back and have those conversations, continue to talk about what DeImplementation looks like. And after you've shared and had a conversation, please leave us a review on it, iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, thank you, everybody. And you're going to be in for many great conversations in season 2 of the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. Ariel, always good to spend some time with you.
Talk to you later.